This podcast is sponsored by AXA Farm Insurance. AXA offers tailored cover to fit your unique needs, whether it's public liability or protection for your family home, outbuildings or farm vehicles. Based in Athlone, the AXA Farm team of agri-specialists and regional managers work together to ensure you receive the seamless support you need. Switching to AXA is easy thanks to an innovative online service that enables you to quickly and easily find the best cover for your needs. For more information, head to axa.ie. AXA Insurance DAC is regulated by the Central Bank of Ireland. Thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to AgriFocus, the podcast brought to you by Agriland and AXA Insurance. I'm Stella Meehan and I'm joined today by Dr. Gerald Barry, who is Assistant Professor of Virology and Deputy Director of the One Health Centre at UCD, to discuss bluetongue and its implications. Over the past week, Agriland reported on the news that there was a suspected bluetongue case reported on a farm near Bangor, County Down in Northern Ireland. Results from Northern Ireland's Department of Agriculture's active surveillance for bluetongue indicated the presence of the disease in 2 cows. So they have activated stringent disease control measures there, including a 20-kilometre temporary control zone and restrictions on the movement of livestock. I want to drill down now into the detail of bluetongue and what it means for farmers. So, Dr. Barry, thank you very much for joining us. Firstly, I want to ask, how were the cases of suspected bluetongue virus detected that we heard about there in Northern Ireland?
So because there's been a number of cases in the UK over the last few years, both here in Ireland and in the north, there's been ongoing surveillance by collecting blood from animals in abattoirs. And so that's just routine surveillance, not based on disease or clinical signs, just random blood samples from cattle. And they would be tested routinely in regional labs or national labs. And as part of that surveillance at the end of last week, 2 cows tested positive for bluetongue antibodies.
So at that stage, that means that they test the blood, it goes to the lab, they determine it, and then they go back to the livestock owner or the Department of Agriculture and inform them.
So like in every cow, as you know, is kind of traced and tracked, so we know exactly where they've come from, where they've been. So bloods would have been collected, would have been sent to the lab for routine testing. Antibodies tested positive, so that would indicate that those animals had been infected at some point in the past by bluetongue. That was probably in the recent past because they were antibody positive. Immediately then that would have been traced back to the farm where they would have come from, and national authorities would have sent out people to investigate potential other infections on that farm. So looking at things like clinical disease in the animals, any evidence of disease circulation, and then they would have, and our ongoing testing of any animals from that farm and probably farms in that region for presence of virus.
I'd imagine since bluetongue became a very serious concern, not just in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, but the UK and across Europe over the last number of months, that we're on high alert for that kind of testing anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. So 2023, there was a really big outbreak in the Netherlands. BTV has been moving across Europe for a number of years now. Different versions or serotypes of BTV have been moving across Europe. There was a major outbreak of BTV3, which is the particular serotype that we're now, or at least have suspected cases in the north. We still have to call them suspected in the north. And that big outbreak happened in the Netherlands. And then subsequently, we started seeing cases in England. And this year, we've seen cases both in England and in Wales. And so, of course, when it hits the UK, you start to think that the Republic of Ireland is vulnerable to these kind of things as well. And so, in a way, it isn't unexpected that it has come here. But the department has been very much on high alert and has instigated these kind of surveillance processes, because the quicker you detect it, the more likely you are going to be able to stamp it out before it becomes endemic or a major problem. And the North were doing the same on the presumption that it was eventually going to get here. If you catch it early, you hope that you stop it getting a foothold in the country. And that's really what that surveillance was all about. And hopefully, by picking it up now, it might be able to stop it becoming a major, major problem.
I know during the summer I had been speaking to a scientist from AFBI, and they said it was more or less a certainty that it was probably going to come into the country, not an if, but a when. And at that time they were talking so much about midges and, you know, their contribution to this particular virus. Can you explain that to people who might not be that well up on how it's transmitted?
Yeah, so the predominant way that it's transmitted is by midge biting. So a midge will bite an infected animal. It will take up a blood meal. Typically, that blood meal then will be used by the midge to help it lay eggs, for example. So it's very typical for female midges to take a blood meal. In that blood, if there's virus, the virus will actually infect the midge itself, spread throughout the midge, and settle in the salivary glands of the midge. So that if the midge then feeds on another animal a few days later, when it bites the animal, it actually spits saliva into the bite site. And that saliva keeps the blood flowing. It has anticoagulant properties. It also has anti-pain-killing properties. So the animal doesn't necessarily feel that it's being bitten, much like we wouldn't really feel. But actually we notice it after the midge is gone. We don't actually feel the bite itself. That saliva, though, because the virus has settled in the salivary glands of the midge, that saliva, when it's spat by the midge into the bite site, can transmit virus from the salivary glands of the midge into the animal itself. And that will move into the blood of the animal and start to infect the animal itself. And that's how bluetongue predominantly moves between animals. It needs a midge carrier to move it from one host to another. And that can be from cow to cow, from cow to sheep. It doesn't go into humans. That's an important thing. So a midge that is carrying bluetongue might well bite a human, but it won't transmit, or at least it can't infect humans. So bluetongue won't infect humans. It won't cause disease in humans. But if it bites a sheep or a cow or maybe a goat, then bluetongue will potentially infect that animal and cause disease.
And with the recent weather patterns that we have, obviously, when I was speaking to the AFBI researcher during the summer, we were coming into the end of summertime, which is predominantly the time for midge migration, as they say. But we've had very different weather patterns this year than, you know, we would traditionally have at this time of year. It's been quite mild. Is the weather that we're having at the moment, would that be conducive to still supporting the transmission from midges, or do you think they have cleared off now?
So the typical kind of weather you need is kind of above 10 degrees, really. You know, peak activity is kind of 15 to 20 degrees for midges, and maybe even a little bit beyond that. Nice settled weather, not too much wind, and things will allow the midge population to kind of build up and settle. When the weather starts to get colder, midge activity reduces. And so if you look at, for example, in summer like December or January, typically in Ireland, there's very little midge activity. And then midge activity will start to pick up again kind of come March, April, when the weather generally increases in temperature. Now, of course, the weather isn't as consistent maybe as it once was. And so that period can extend in some cases. And if we get milder winters, that can extend the activity of the midge into that those kind of later months of the year or even earlier in the new year. And it also allows potentially larger populations to persist over the winter. So all these kind of climate change factors, if it's slightly wetter, for example, that can also be of benefit to them. So all these kind of slightly different climate change, potentially related changes in the weather may contribute to extended seasons for the midge. But predominantly we're kind of talking April to kind of October. That's normally the kind of activity peaking around June, July, August. That's typically what we'd expect in terms of midge activity.
And Dr. Barry, once an animal contracts the bluetongue virus, they might have it, but how would a livestock owner identify it via symptoms? Do they display symptoms? Do they not?
So I think there's a couple of important things to note. So when bluetongue infects an animal, it really likes to infect what are known as endothelial cells. So typically things like blood vessels, for example, and that can cause a breakdown of blood vessels. That can cause leakage of blood or other fluids inside the body of the animal. And it'll cause, particularly in sheep, clinical signs such as lethargy, unwillingness to move, and high fever as an initial sign of disease. And that can instead extend then into things like swelling around the face, where you get this buildup of fluid. In some cases, you do see a kind of a purpling or bluish colour associated with the tongue, hence the name blue tongue, but that isn't always the case. And you do see other things like drooling, breathing difficulties, sores on the nose, the gums, the dental pad, some reddening of mucous membranes. So actually the clinical signs are quite varied. Not all animals will display clinical signs. Sheep tend to display clinical signs more readily than cattle. So cows a lot of the time actually can be subclinical. They won't necessarily show disease. And so when we think about blue tongue, we look at cattle as amplifying hosts, which basically means that they don't necessarily get sick, but they actually replicate the virus really well. And so they can be a real spreader of the virus because their blood can contain a lot of virus. And so if a midge feeds on them, there's a high potential for the midge to pick up virus from that infected animal and move it on to another one. Of course, that's challenging if they don't look sick. How do you pick it up? And that's potentially what's happened with these two cattle, for example, that went to the abattoir maybe with no clinical signs. Sheep, on the other hand, do tend to show more clinical signs more readily. You see higher mortality in sheep as well. And so sheep, in terms of first awareness of disease, tend to be the ones that we see disease emerging in before we might become more obvious in cattle.
And if you have blue tongue in a live animal on your farm, or two live animals, so it will be dependent on a midge biting them and transferring it to the rest of the herd. The animals can't transfer animal to animal themselves.
Yeah, exactly. So for BTV3, the one that has been detected in the north, the midge is what is required to spread it from animal to animal. There's no evidence that blue tongue will transmit through something like contact, for example, or one animal coughing on another or something like that. The way we would think about maybe a respiratory illness in cattle or something like foot and mouth, for example, which would spread really rapidly through contact. Blue tongue is quite a different virus. It tends to spread through midges. It should be said it can also spread to the unborn lamb or calf as well. Now, that's relatively rare, but it's a potential route of transmission as well. And so it can spread and infect lambs and calves before they're born. And that can lead to, in some cases, abortion or malformations. It should be stressed that the midge is the predominant way that it's spread. And of course, the impact of that is that it slows down transmission potentially because you're requiring that midge to animal to midge to animal transmission route compared to something that, like, say influenza in humans, where it would just spread through the air in a really rapid way. But of course, it also leads to challenges in terms of control, because how do you control a large midge population that's flying around the place? That's a very difficult challenge. So pros and cons really in the way we tackle this and understand how this transmits.
And just from an animal point of view then, and forgive, I suppose, my basic knowledge of this, if an animal, a live animal, has blue tongue, is it like a human flu? Do they get treated? I mean, obviously, if you have a dairy animal, their productivity, their milk production will drop, as it would, all of our production drops when we get a virus and don't feel well enough to work. So is there any treatment? There isn't, I'm assuming.
Well, so probably that's one of the first things actually to say. Another maybe clinical sign that we should be aware of in cattle, milk yield drop is perhaps in some cases the first signal that you might have an infection, whether it's blue tongue or another infection, because productivity, as you say, will be affected. And so it's something for dairy farmers to be very much aware of, whether it's blue tongue or some other infectious disease. Unfortunately, there isn't a direct treatment or antiviral treatment for blue tongue. There is a vaccine available. And that can be administered in advance of infection if you think it's in the area or there's potential for it. Unfortunately, that vaccine isn't licensed for use in Ireland at the moment. It's being used or has been licensed in the UK under emergency authority, controlled by national authorities. That hasn't happened in Ireland, but we would expect that would happen if we got cases in the country. So unfortunately, there isn't a direct treatment. It's very much because this is a notifiable virus, the animals would be removed from the herd. They can go direct to abattoir. Because there isn't a food safety concern or a human health concern, they can go to the abattoir. But there isn't any treatment, or there wouldn't really be a treatment used against this virus. It's more about control, cull and eradicate.
You've answered my question there about any sort of threat to human health by a bluetongue animal carcass going into the food supply chain. But as you said at the outset, the bluetongue is never a threat to human health.
It doesn't infect humans. It doesn't cause disease in humans. It can't be transmitted from food into humans. So there's no human health concern, thankfully, with this virus.
In terms of the vaccine that you mentioned there, is vaccine coverage sufficient, do you think, to control a potential outbreak at the moment, we'll say on the Northern Ireland, UK side?
There's over 20 different versions, or what we call serotypes of bluetongue. Each different serotype needs a different vaccine, unfortunately, because they're slightly different from each other.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a bit annoying.
Yeah.
The predominant ones on this side of Europe, let's say, are BTV3 and BTV8. England has had predominantly BTV3 cases. They've had a few BTV8 cases. The cases suspected in the north of Ireland are BTV3. There is a vaccine available. Unfortunately, however, that vaccine is not perfect. So while it does reduce clinical signs, it doesn't block infection, and it also doesn't block the transmission from an infected animal to another animal. So although it does reduce the likelihood, because it generally reduces the amount of virus in that animal can potentially still transmit to another animal. And so the challenge there is that means you can't use vaccine alone to control an outbreak. Because if you do, you're never really going to stamp it out, because the vaccine allows onward transmission from animal to animal. Now, if you were able to vaccinate, in theory, all the animals in the herd or in the national herd, then over a period of time, but potentially years, vaccine alone might be enough. But a lot of countries actually have found, and France is one example, where when bluetongue came into France, they tried to use vaccination, and they found actually that it wasn't enough to control it. And so in a lot of cases, they don't necessarily recommend the use of vaccines anymore. And they've kind of used other measures, or to an extent have accepted that bluetongue is now part of the landscape in those countries. And so that's potentially something for us to consider. Really, at the moment, the focus should be on rapid and aggressive surveillance for early detection of cases to try and limit its impact on a particular herd, but also limit its potential spread to other herds. That's what the focus is and should be on. If it gets into the midge population and becomes, let's say, persistent in that population, as in we see multiple years of cases, and those cases are increasing year on year, then different challenges become a reality, let's say, because then we have to start looking at widespread vaccination potentially, rather than targeted zonal protection of animals through vaccination. The potential for, rather than having, like we have in the north, a 20-kilometre restriction movement of animals, in England, for example, the whole of England is a restriction zone. And so movement of animals perhaps might need to come with testing for BTV before moving. So all these kind of things need to be considered in the future, not now. But and because vaccination isn't enough, then all these other factors become a reality. The alternative, of course, is that we see if we can make a better vaccine. But that is a long-term aim as well. And that's, potentially 5 or 10 years away as well. So that's not something that's on the horizon. So while vaccination is useful, it's not enough.
Is herd immunity any sort of potential?
Herd immunity through vaccination would help. Herd immunity through infection, you get into a dynamic there where fundamentally you have two things going on. You have bluetongue causing disease, and in naive populations, particularly in sheep, you could see really high rates of mortality. So in the Netherlands outbreak for BTV3 back in 2023, it's estimated that of the animals that showed clinical signs, about 70 to 75% of those died. Now, the animals that showed clinical signs was only about somewhere between 5 and 7% of the overall number of sheep that were infected. So the total numbers were relatively low, but still that's a very high rate of mortality if you think about it. And so we need to consider whether that's a route we want to go down, and consider the impact that that's going to have not only on the animals but also on the farmers, in terms of income, but mental health impacts and the concern and worry that you would have for your flock. The impact isn't quite as great with cattle, as we mentioned. The clinical signs are not as regular or obvious in cattle, but it could have production impacts, and so there's an economic concern there. But also the other impact is potentially on our ability to export products, and whether countries internationally will accept products, live animals or otherwise, from a country like Ireland if bluetongue was endemic in the country. So these are factors that would need to be considered, and most likely that is not the route we want to go down.
Absolutely. And one final question, I suppose I'll ask you in terms of overall virology and patterns that you and your peers might have seen. Is this a sort of cycle that happens where you see, many years ago, there was BSE that was very prevalent, and then foot and mouth, and then in human health, we've had obviously COVID and various influenza. Bird flu is a big concern at the moment, again, in agriculture. Are there cycles of this that seem to just emerge at different periods of time?
I think to an extent, yes. I mean, like if we look at Europe in general, I don't think it's unreasonable to say that Europe is being bombarded at the moment by a whole variety of different viruses. We saw there is an ongoing major outbreak of African swine fever in France, for example, where they've actually deployed the army to try and control it in the last week. We have African swine fever in Eastern Europe is a major challenge. We have PPR in sheep in the Balkan regions. Avian influenza is an ongoing challenge and has been for the last few years. Bluetongue has been slowly moving across Europe, and now looks like it's finally coming to our shores. And if you track even in human diseases, things like mosquito-borne infections are slowly moving northwards from the Mediterranean basin into kind of Central Europe as well. So I think there's a number of things going on. I think a change in weather and climate is having an impact. The warming of the climate is benefiting particularly vector-borne diseases, things that are spread by mosquitoes, ticks, midges. They're all benefiting from a slightly warmer and wetter climate, allowing them to move and be productive more northerly. That's not necessarily a cycle. That's probably a reality now ongoing. But you also then have things like influenza that evolve over time, and every now and then a new version emerges, and then that will move through the population, wiping out a certain percentage, maybe of wild birds, for example. And then the population will build an immunity to it, and so the impact will reduce until another version comes along, and that will inevitably come along. And so you do see cycles with things like avian influenza, where the wild bird population is slowly adapting to whatever version is cycling through at the moment. We are having an ongoing massive pandemic, one could call it, of avian influenza that has been going on for the last few years. And unfortunately with bluetongue, it's a little bit different. I think different serotypes come into regions, BTV8, BTV3, our herd may or may not build resistance to it over time. If it becomes endemic, the herd will, to an extent, build an immunity to it. What we see with something like Schmallenberg, for example, which is another midge-borne virus in sheep, particularly causing problems in sheep and sometimes in cattle as well, we see cycles of that. So herd immunity builds, impact reduces. But as the herd let's say, ends up in the abattoir and new naive animals come into the herd, then we see an uptick in clinical signs, things like abortions, for example. And so we see cycles of impact of Schmallenberg every 5 to 6 years. Potentially something like that could happen with bluetongue. It's a little bit difficult to predict that as of yet, because we hope that endemic nature won't become a reality if we can stamp it out before it becomes a major problem. But that's a big if, and I think that's going to be a big challenge. I'm not convinced we'll be able to do it.
Well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for on this week's episode of AgriFocus, in which we concentrated on bluetongue. And thank you very much to our guest, Dr. Gerald Barry from UCD, for joining us today. Please rate and review this podcast to ensure we can continue making informative podcasts for you, our audience. And please do share it with anyone you think might like to listen. Until next time, goodbye and take care.
This podcast is sponsored by AXA Farm Insurance. AXA offers tailored cover to fit your unique needs, whether it's public liability or protection for your family home, outbuildings or farm vehicles. Based in Athlone, the AXA Farm team of agri-specialists and regional managers work together to ensure you receive the seamless support you need. Switching to AXA is easy thanks to an innovative online service that enables you to quickly and easily find the best cover for your needs. For more information, head to axa.ie. AXA Insurance Stack is regulated by the Central Bank of Ireland.